Hello, and welcome to the Future of Our Oceans webinar series. This series is brought to you by Oceans at Duke, a network of faculty and students at Duke University who are committed to ocean sustainability. Our community of scholars is applying cutting-edge insights from ocean science, governance, and business to tackle the ocean's most urgent challenges and opportunities. We thank you for joining us for this monthly series, and we'll be exploring a range of really compelling topics over the next several months, including the role of oceans in human health, drivers and risks of deep sea mining, solutions for ocean plastic pollution, and the evolution of blue tech innovation. Sessions will highlight the latest work of Duke University researchers, but we also look forward to engaging with many of you who are doing related work in institutions of academia or in government, in the private sector. And we look forward to hearing from you about the work that you're doing and opportunities for collaboration. Our purpose with this series is to inform, inspire, and enable you to help ocean ecosystems and communities flourish for the long term. Let me provide just a few guidelines for our session today. Our session will be 60 minutes, including our speakers' presentations and a Q&A session in the last 10 minutes of the hour. Your cameras and microphones are turned off for this session, but we encourage you to share your questions and comments in the Q&A, which is monitored by our team. We also encourage you to go to the Oceans at Duke website, which is linked to your registration to see additional articles, resources related to our topics, details on faculty research, and descriptions of the future webinars that are planned. Today's session will be recorded and posted to the website for our and also our YouTube channel later this week. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Lisa Campbell is the Rachel Carson Distinguished Professor of Marine Affairs and Policy at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. Her research explores ocean governance broadly, in relation to diverse issues like conservation targets, marine protected areas, small-scale fisheries, the blue economy, and marine spatial planning. She draws on political economy and science and technology studies to study how science and other values and state as well as non-state actors inform governance across geographic and socio-political scales. She's also interested in innovative research methods and has published on participatory research, collaborative research, interdisciplinary work, field work, and research ethics. Lisa will be joined today by Dr. Noella Gray, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics at the University of Guelph. A political ecologist by training, Noella's research examines the politics of marine conservation and governance. Her recent work focuses on knowledge conflicts in conservation governance. For example, in her recent work, she focuses on understanding how different forms of knowledge, like science, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, are produced, legitimized, and mobilized in relationship to particular conservation interventions, such as international government agreements, marine protected areas, and volunteer tourism. As a leader of the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, she's working with Indigenous partners to examine the decolonization of international conservation governance. She has a PhD from Duke University. After Noella and Lisa present, Doug Nowacek will join the conversation and lead our Q&A session. Doug is University Professor in the Nicholas School of the Environment and Pratt School of Engineering at Duke University. And his work focuses on the bioacoustics and behavioral ecology of marine mammals, including technology development that can be used for marine conservation. And now I'd like to welcome Lisa and Noella for our conversation on conservation territories at sea. Welcome.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Guelph, where I work, resides on the ancestral territories of the Attawandaron people, as well as the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit.
And in Eastern North Carolina, the Duke Marine Lab, where I work, resides on the ancestral lands of the Coree and Neuse peoples.
And today, the University of Guelph and surrounding community is a gathering place for many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. and acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to the lands where we live and work and to one another. And in addition, given the virtual format of today's talk, I would like to acknowledge that many of you are joining us from traditional territories across Turtle Island and beyond. And I would like to acknowledge all of the peoples who have stewarded the land, the waters, and our relations with them.
Oh, sorry. I'm driving this show and I'm going to get used to it. We also want to start by acknowledging some of our collaborators in the work we're going to present today. In particular, Rebecca Gruby, Sarah Bess Jones-Ziegler, and Leslie Acton are co-authors on a couple of different papers that we're drawing on, and in particular, the one cited here. So let's start. Like many people, I was recently exposed to the fabulous poetry of Amanda Gorman. And almost immediately after she stole the show at Joe Biden's inauguration, another of her poems appeared in my marine science Twitter feed. Many of you probably saw it, Ode to Our Ocean. Now, while our use of Gorman may seem overly opportunistic at this time, the excerpt from this poem is really too on topic for us today to pass up. So I'm going to ask Noella to read it for us.
The story of the ocean and the story of humanity are one and the same. A great river that knows no borders and notes no lines, only ripples. While we might call it the seven seas, today we sing out your true name, the one ocean. For no matter how we try to separate your waters, you are the colossus that connects us.
Right, so it's perfect for us. We hope to convince you, because today we're going to talk about contemporary efforts to divide the colossus, to separate waters with borders and lines. Now, Gorman's poem hints at the futility of these efforts, right? Oceans, by their physical and biological nature, defy separation. But these efforts to bound, to separate, to enclose, and to show those boundaries, divisions and enclosures and maps and visualizations have effect. These effects are multiple, but as social scientists, we're really interested in the social and the political effects. So we're going to explore these efforts to divide the colossus to create conservation territories at sea. And we're going to tell this story in three separate parts. In part one, we want to contextualize the extension of conservation territories to the sea within broader shifts in oceans governance. In part two, we want to look at the relationship between global goals for and national implementation of marine conservation territories. And finally, we'll take a speculative turn in part three and ask some questions about current and ongoing efforts to extend conservation territories to the high seas. In part one of this research, we are drawing on work that we've been conducting with a group of colleagues since 2008 to innovate both theory and methods for studying major international meetings. We position these meetings as sites where global conservation governance is negotiated, and those negotiations become visible to us as researchers. Now, Noella and I are part of a subgroup within the larger collaboration that's been trying to detail the emergence of what we call a global marine conservation agenda. And we'll draw on this work here. So if you were at the first seminar in the Ocean at Duke series, you'll remember that my colleagues in the Marine Geospatial Ecology Lab detailed increasing interest in the oceans among a variety of actors and stakeholder groups for both their conservation and their development potential. For social scientists, it's a really exciting time to study oceans governance because just so much is happening.
So for example, there are two ongoing sets of international negotiations that will potentially transform how we govern the 2/3 of the ocean that lies in areas beyond national jurisdiction, or Abnj. The United Nations is currently negotiating an implementing agreement under the Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the International Seabed Authority, meanwhile, is negotiating rules for the extraction of deep sea minerals in the area, that portion of the seabed and ocean floor that is beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. And less specific, but possibly more prolific, is interest in the blue economy, which is increasing with each passing day. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development projects that by 2030, the ocean economy will be twice as important to the global economy as it is today, contributing more than $3 trillion to the global value added. And this explains much of the contemporary interest in the oceans, their economic potential. And realizing these interests and notions are often premised on, and even require in many cases, drawing boundaries and lines, dividing the colossus to organize and allocate space for different activities, such as the ones you see in this visualization. So our talk today is premised on an understanding that maps are never just representations or descriptions of space, but productive of space. Maps play a role in transforming how we imagine oceans, and thus how we imagine possibilities for governing them.
So marine spatial planning probably best illustrates this particular understanding of maps and mapping. So this map is one of the Netherlands, and it's fairly typical. The map distinguishes between land and sea, and there's some distinction on land, in this case, political boundaries, but the sea is an undifferentiated even blue. The second map shows the Netherlands, this time with the marine spatial plan overlaid on top. And this transforms the seascape, revealing an ocean that's differentiated by lines, polygons, colors. But the map is not just an input into or a support for management. In this case, it really is management. It doesn't just describe marine space or user groups, but it allocates particular activities to particular spaces and grants access to some users while restricting access by others. And it's in this functionality of maps as productive of space, that we're really interested. So in this talk, we want to explore the relationship between mapping and how we think about oceans as political and social spaces.
So when we think about space as social and political, it's helpful to use the concept of territory, which Eldon defined as bounded space within which a particular actor or group, typically a state, exercises control. So we have three essential elements here for territory as a concept. Territorial control is exercised for many purposes. Historically and predominantly, it has been a tool of nation states to claim land and natural resources, as well as the benefits of their extraction. But control can also be exercised for purposes of conserving natural resources and deriving benefits from that conservation, resulting in a conservation territory. And that's our focus today.
So in the terrestrial realm, mapping has been fundamental to establishing and exercising state control over territory. But what about territory at sea? So in the history of the modern nation state, oceans have mostly been left out of state projects of territorialization. Rather than as a space amenable to division, oceans have been characterized and mapped as what Anderson and Peters describe as a perfect and absolute blank. This is a space where people, society, and territory are mostly absent. Now, this is in part due to the physical characteristics at sea, the difficulty of bounding space in a meaningful way in a fluid and three-dimensional environment, and then translating those boundaries into barriers for entry, for example, by laying fences. I mean, those are real constraints on territory. But this characterization of oceans also reflects and supports political commitments to the free, frictionless, and unfettered movement of military, capital, and communications across and below a smooth ocean surface. And this underlying understanding of oceans is not the only one, but it came to dominate global ocean governance because it served the interests of politically powerful states in freedom of movement. So yes, physical characteristics may matter, but they only partly explain this lack of territory at sea. Political and economic interests are also explanatory. As geographer Phil Steinberg describes, over the past 500 years, oceans governance has been marked by this alternating currents for and against division and territorial enclosure. And these currents shift with changing political and economic interests. So any attempts to understand new interests in territorializing the sea for conservation or anything else need to be attuned to the political and economic interests that drive that.
So perhaps the most noteworthy contemporary extension of territory to the sea occurred when coastal states claimed their 200-mile exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, under UNCLOS, a move that has been described as the largest simultaneous enclosure of the commons. However, aside from this, powerful nation states such as the US, Russia, the United Kingdom have mostly resisted further territorialization at sea in recent decades. This resistance is increasingly being challenged, though, as deep seabed mining seems increasingly likely and as other interests and actors engage in ocean governance. For example, non-state actors, such as environmental NGOs, philanthropies, scientific collaborations, have led international efforts to extend conservation territories to oceans, primarily via marine protected areas. So we have increasing interest in control by a diversity of actors.
And today we're going to focus on efforts to territorialize the oceans for the purposes of conservation through the establishment of marine protected areas. So marine protected areas are important and interesting for a couple of reasons. First, as this map of Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument illustrates, marine protected areas are areas. They're geographically based and spatially bound. Second, most MPAs are implemented in national waters by nation states. The monument is a national monument established by presidential executive order. Third, control is exercised for the purposes of conservation, and commercial fishing is prohibited throughout the monument. But there are other reasons that marine protected areas are really interesting. First among those is that if your goal is increased territorialization, then marine protected areas have experienced remarkable success over the last 15 years. And the best way to capture that success is in maps. Oh, there's my things.
So this map is from 2008 and shows that 13 years ago, less than 1% of the global ocean was protected in MPAs. At this resolution, it's difficult to see most MPAs on the map. You might recognize iconic sites such as the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park off the coast of Australia, or the Galapagos off the coast of Ecuador, or Papahanaumokuakea on the far left side of your screen. But most MPAs are too small to see at this resolution. The median size of MPAs at that time was less than 5 square kilometers. If we fast forward to 2019, close to 8% of the global ocean was protected within MPAs. So let's just show this change again one time for the full impact. We'll go back to 2008 and forward again to 2019. This is territorialization at light speed. Note that there aren't just more MPAs, there are more bigger MPAs. And these MPAs are so much bigger than that previous median size that they have their own name, large scale marine protected areas, or LSMPAs. And when Papahanaumokuakea was announced in 2006, it changed the way that marine conservationists were thinking about their goals. At that time, they were arguing for more MPAs, for better networked MPAs. And although there were also arguments that MPAs should be bigger, few imagined in 2006 the possibility of this many MPAs this big. So at our last count, there were 37 large-scale MPAs, those that are greater than 100,000 square kilometers. Half of those were more than 250,000 square kilometers, and 5 of those were more than 1 million square kilometers. So this supersizing trend has both increased the rate of territorialization of the ocean and also made it visible on a global scale. And we argue that this global scale visibility is powerful.
So this success in MPA expansion has to be considered in the context of global agreements on marine protected areas targets. For example, through the Convention on Biological Diversity's Aichi targets, parties agreed in 2010 to meet a 10% area coverage target by 2020. At the time of the agreement, less than 1% of the oceans were in MPAs. So this was significantly ambitious. The UN Sustainable Development Goals in SDG 14 adopted the same numeric component of that target, 10%, this time to be achieved by 2030. Now, whether or not specific large marine protected areas are motivated by these targets, they collectively underwrite progress towards their achievement. Although there are more than 18,000 marine protected areas worldwide, the 20 largest, just 20, account for more than 65% of global MPA coverage. So this success has spurred marine conservationists to advocate for even higher targets. For example, in the 30 by 30 campaign that aims for 30% of the oceans in marine protected areas by 2030. 30% is a serious contender in the next set of CBD targets, and it's included in a draft of the post-2020 agenda. Whether or not it stays there, this is pretty significant. The figure would have been laughable just over a decade ago when the Aichi targets were negotiated.
So we are arguing that this map doesn't just document MPA expansion, it also tells a story of a global ocean increasingly conserved and makes further expansion of marine protected areas, higher, more ambitious targets, for example, the 30% by 2030, imaginable. So to summarize part one so far, this is a story of the expansion of conservation territories, namely marine protected areas at sea. And it is a global story underwritten by a series of targets emerging from international organizations and agreements and captured in these global scale maps. And we argue that the map of progress towards global oceans conserved supports a new understanding of oceans in which their characterization as unpeopled and absolute blank is replaced by oceans in need of and amenable to area-based conservation. So the map makes higher and more ambitious targets of MPA expansion possible. In other words, the map is both a product of and productive of ocean conservation. And the map of progress towards global oceans conserved reinforces the global as a relevant scale where conservation can and should be done and outcomes and impacts assessed.
So we arrive at part two of the story, where we turn our attention to aligning national and global interests in marine conservation. Because although large-scale MPA expansion is a global phenomena and it's mapped as such, most large-scale marine protected areas are implemented at the national level. In part two of our story, we want to think about large-scale marine protected areas as both a global phenomena and as site-specific conservation territories implemented by nation states. And to remind, we've isolated these three components of territory: bounded space, actors, and control. And we're going to focus on the second of these, the role of particular actors and actor groups in both exercising and contesting territorial control through large-scale marine protected areas. We're particularly interested in the typical role of the nation state, and we'll illustrate that large-scale marine protected areas both reinforce and challenge this role. And to do this, we've engaged in some map making of our own. Now, before we proceed, we want to acknowledge that there are multiple debates about large-scale marine protected areas, and many are concerned with their ecological value and their contributions to biological diversity. So we acknowledge these debates and these interests, but we're not going to address them today. Our interests are in these social and political aspects.
So as we move between the global and national story of large-scale MPAs, part two of the story draws on results of a 3-year research project on the human dimensions of large marine protected areas, which was led by our colleague, Dr. Rebecca Gruby at Colorado State University. And this project explored the governance, politics, and outcomes associated with large MPAs at 5 sites. So at the time of our research, large-scale MPAs had been established at 3 of these sites: the Marianas Trench Marine National Monument in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, U.S. territory, the Phoenix Islands Protected Area in Kiribati, and the Palau National Marine Sanctuary in Palau. In Rapa Nui, the Chilean government had declared a large-scale MPA, but governance details were still being negotiated at the time of our research. And at our final site in Bermuda, a large-scale MPA had been proposed, but not established. And so these sites cover a range of political and governance contexts and outcomes. And just as with part one, we draw on our results very broadly in this talk, and we direct people interested in this work to the website that you see noted on the screen there to learn more about our project and findings. But it was our work in this project that got us thinking about ocean territorialization. And to be clear, in all of these interviews and media reports and documentation and all of the work we did in this project, we found very few direct and explicit references to ideas of territory or territorialization. But we did find substantial evidence that sovereignty was an issue at all sites. And sovereignty is closely associated with the idea of territory in the modern state system, which brings us back to this map. Territorial state sovereignty refers to the sovereign control of the space bounded by national borders, which at sea are delineated by the EEZs that you see mapped here. And as maps of large-scale MPAs show, many of them align with EEZs for all or part of their borders, as you can see here with Papahanaumokuakea. So this alignment suggests that large-scale MPAs are a means of asserting or reasserting state claims to existing territories. For island nations in particular, a large-scale MPA might serve strategic political purposes. So many islands have EEZs that are much larger than their terrestrial territory, and sovereignty over these vast ocean spaces is often difficult to enforce.
And so this is the first of our own maps. Global large-scale MPA expansion puts island states on the map in new ways, right? The global map makes islands visible collectively by drawing our attention away from land to oceans. We actually recenter our maps on the Pacific to capture most of the LSMPAs and their locations. Individually, islands that are too small to be seen on a global map are made newly visible when their large exclusive economic zones are filled in to highlight a large-scale MPA. So we've been following more generally the role of small island developing states in global marine conservation. SIDS, as they're called, is the formal United Nations designation of 38 small island nations, and Pacific SIDS in particular have positioned themselves as leaders in marine conservation, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also more generally, and in climate change debates. So establishing large-scale marine protected areas is well aligned with these efforts, and with work by several SIDS to rebrand SIDS as large ocean states and large ocean territories rather than as small island developing states. So some SIDS may realize increased sovereignty by using a large-scale MPA to protect biodiversity, but also to claim benefits from resource use. And through conservation-related monitoring and enforcement, territorial sovereignty might also be enhanced in practice. So let's take the example of Palau, noted here on the map at site 16. So in Palau, the establishment of the Palau National Marine Sanctuary was part of a broader effort to assert territorial sovereignty over its EEZ. Now, Palau has a long-standing commitment to marine conservation, but the PNMS was also directed at capturing benefits from a foreign-dominated tuna fishing industry. The no-take PNMS in light blue mostly aligns with the EEZ, while the dark blue marks a domestic fishing zone where there's some limited participation by foreign fleets. Palau also sought to enhance sovereignty by reducing illegal and underreported fishing in its EEZ. And by establishing the PNMS, Palau gained access to remote monitoring and surveillance support through the Project Eyes on the Seas program, a partnership between the Pew Charitable Trust and Satellite Applications Catapult. When surveillance technology is made available to help monitor and enforce large-scale marine protected areas, it can also help Palau or other SIDS in the same situation overcome long-standing challenges with exercising sovereignty more generally, right? It can support conservation, but also other things. So the global large-scale marine protected area map can support a story of increased island visibility and sovereignty, as well as SIDS as leaders in ocean conservation. And in some countries like Palau, increased sovereignty may also be realized in practice.
However, as this next map shows, only 3 countries in the UN SIDS group, Kiribati, Palau, and Seychelles, have implemented large-scale MPAs. We also include Cook Islands on this map, even though it's not in the UN SIDS group because of its free association with New Zealand. So if not SIDS, who then is establishing large-scale MPAs, and what are the sovereignty concerns? So this next map shows large-scale MPAs according to countries that have the most MPA coverage: the United States, United Kingdom, France, Australia, Cook Islands, Chile, and then others are noted in gray. And these countries have achieved this coverage in large part via large-scale MPAs established in former colonies that are now governed as territories, dependencies, and protectorates, and often thousands of miles distant from the administrative center of sovereign power. So this map raises the possibility that large-scale MPAs, if they are implemented to assert sovereignty, may be doing so in places where that is contested. And in some cases, this is a reasonable interpretation. Perhaps the most egregious case comes from the UK government's establishment of a no-take large-scale MPA in the British Indian Ocean Territory, or Chagos Archipelago, in 2010. And you see that circled on the map. The Chagos Archipelago was excised in 1965 from the former British colony of Mauritius. Mauritius and displaced native Chagosians dispute UK sovereignty in this territory. And the UK was widely criticized for using the large-scale MPA to reinforce territorial claims. And although the UN High Court ruled in favor of Mauritius' territorial claim in February of 2019, and the UN General Assembly upheld this again in May 2019, the UK has refused to abide by the decision, and the large-scale MPA remains. What will happen moving forward remains to be seen. Other large-scale MPA designations in UK overseas territories have been less politically fraught. For example, the Pitcairn Islands Marine Reserve reportedly enjoys unanimous support among inhabitants. So regardless, it is clear that large-scale MPAs are a priority of and initiated by the UK government. And the UK government's Blue Belt program aims to establish MPAs in 4 million square kilometers of ocean in UK overseas territories. It has already achieved 3.6 million square kilometers towards this goal.
However, a map that reveals large-scale marine protected areas as a conservation project to assert sovereignty in former colonies, something we might call a neo-colonial conservation project, this too misses the story of how local people, including indigenous peoples, in particular places have mobilized in response to large-scale MPAs. For example, Native Hawaiians have been involved with the establishment and ongoing management of Papahanaumokuakea U.S. National Marine Monument, which increasingly reflects Native Hawaiians' priorities and values, enhances cultural connection, and facilitates cultural practice. In Rapa Nui, Chile, a contested and initially top-down large-scale marine protected area process transitioned through Rapa Nui resistance and subsequent consultations. So an initial vision for a no-take marine park is now a multi-use marine protected area that will be co-administered by a sea council with majority indigenous Rapa Nui members. So these examples illustrate that large-scale marine protected areas can provide opportunities for indigenous peoples to strengthen connections or claims to ocean spaces. They temper a story of large-scale marine protected areas as neo-colonial conservation and highlight sovereignty as a concern of indigenous peoples within states. But the possibilities here should not be overstated. In both Hawaii and Rapa Nui, indigenous responses to these large-scale marine protected areas are varied, right? There are people for and against them. So a global map revealing large-scale marine protected areas, either as neo-colonial control or indigenous empowerment, fails to capture the place-based politics at particular sites.
So far, we've focused primarily on state actors, whether small islands or colonial powers, as well as indigenous peoples. However, non-state actors, especially environmental non-governmental organizations or NGOs, also help to define, produce, and control state territory for conservation. And Dr. Libby Lundstrom has advanced the concept of articulated sovereignty to describe this, in which sovereignty is not just the realm of the state, but a set of competencies that are articulated through ongoing interactions among state and non-state actors. Environmental NGOs have played a central role in large-scale MPA expansion. So for example, National Geographic has led scientific expeditions to support the establishment of large-scale MPAs through its Pristine Seas project. Conservation International has played and continues to play a critical role in the Phoenix Island protected area in Kiribati. The Nature Conservancy facilitated a debt for blue nature swap in the Seychelles, which led to marine spatial planning throughout the entire EEZ, as well as the recent designation of 2 large-scale marine protected areas. And finally, the Pew Charitable Trust's Pew Bertarelli Ocean Legacy Project aims to establish 15 fully protected marine parks of 200,000 square kilometers or greater by 2022. So NGO involvement has been critiqued by a number of scholars and activists, many of whom accuse them of, quote, blue grabbing or ocean grabbing, the process by which powerful actors capture control of decision-making related to access and use of ocean space. So in our work, the role of NGOs was a common theme among interviewees, but we found competing interpretations of their role. So at extremes, we have contrasting cases of Palau, where NGO involvement was generally seen positively as advancing the state's effort to enhance its sovereignty, to Bermuda, where the role of an outside NGO was heavily critiqued by opponents of the proposed LSMPA as an imposition on or a threat to state sovereignty. But in most cases, perceptions were really mixed. So for example, in Kiribati, the involvement of environmental NGOs and philanthropists has been viewed as both increasing and threatening state sovereignty. So for some, NGO support, for example, for surveillance activities, like we saw in Palau, has increased state control over ocean space, enhancing sovereignty and a sense of national ownership. For others, the role of NGOs in the trust fund that finances the MPA and their related roles in decision-making are seen as a threat to state sovereignty, with some even describing it as, quote, selling sovereignty. So across large-scale MPAs, we see a variety of forms of articulated sovereignty in which multiple state and non-state actors assert control in often contested ways.
So to summarize part 2 of the story, the dominant global large-scale MPA map is made through individual countries taking actions that collectively are counted toward a shared goal. So we've mobilized the concept of territory and territorial sovereignty to highlight the diverse sovereignty concerns associated with these large-scale MPAs and in specific MPA sites. We highlighted the diversity of actors asserting, supporting, and contesting sovereignty. Nation states, yes, but also former colonizing states, indigenous peoples, and non-government organizations. And we made our own maps, both to support our analysis, but also to problematize it. All global maps of large-scale MPAs, including those we produced, obscure the outcomes and experiences of individual large-scale MPAs, nationally and locally. So we return to those sites because individual large-scale MPAs are always the outcomes of particular political struggles and processes, and they succeed or they'll fail in particular places. The impacts for people and the marine environment will be multiple, complex, uneven, interacting, and evolving, and they're placed in context specific. And so we focused on sovereignty in this talk, but our work in the Human Dimensions of Large MPAs project reveals a variety of social and political outcomes associated with these transformations and processes of transformations of ocean spaces. The outcomes are experienced and valued differently by different user groups and stakeholders. And so we arrive at part 3 of our story, where we want to wrap up and conclude by turning our attention to the high seas and ongoing interest there in extending conservation territories.
So we want to think about some of the lessons we learned from studying large-scale MPAs as contested conservation territories as we face the next potential wave of LSMPA expansion into the high seas. So this graph of MPA expansion over the past 20 years shows that gains have been largely made within national waters, within EEZs. And the increase in high seas MPAs in 2017 that you see on the purple bar there comes entirely from the establishment of one site, the Ross Sea Region MPA in Antarctica at 1.55 million square kilometers. So most future gains are likely to come on the high seas, which is why area-based conservation measures are a critical component of the negotiations for the UNCLOS implementing agreement that we mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So how do we extend conservation territories into this space? There are several challenges worth considering. First, there's the difficulty of bounding space. UNCLOS provided a universal boundary of 200 nautical miles for EEZs, which many coastal states have simply reinforced with their large-scale MPAs. Other boundaries or rationales for drawing them must be found if conservation territories are to be established on the high seas. Existing high seas MPAs have been established by regional organizations, such as CAMLAR in the Antarctic. However, for high seas more generally, it's necessary to create an understanding of that space as territory amenable to conservation.
And indeed, there are emergent understandings of the high seas that do just that, right? This is a map of ecologically and biologically significant areas on the high seas, identified through a Convention on Biological Diversity sponsored process in which Pat Halpin's lab has really played a central role. So we can identify spaces that we might bound. Now, if we assume control over these or other bounded spaces is for conservation, then a second challenge emerges regarding actors. Like, who is exercising control over the space? Whose interests are represented and whose are overlooked? So from a UN perspective, every state and its citizens have a stake in the oceans through the Common Heritage Principle. So these stakes are captured in negotiations about things like access and benefit sharing, how states with coasts or industrial and how states without coasts and without industrial and technological capacity to benefit from high seas conservation and development, will share in the benefits from any new governance arrangements. So some states have expressed concern that extending conservation territories into the high seas will actually detract from conservation within the EEZ. So state interests in territorialization are multiple and are expressed in the ongoing negotiations. But other actors are also relevant. So Lundstrom draws our attention to articulated sovereignty via non-government organizations, but it can also be exercised via industrial interests. The role of NGOs, of philanthropic funders, and industrial stakeholders needs to be explicitly recognized in identifying, designating, and ultimately controlling any conservation territories that might emerge from ongoing processes. It's also a mistake to assume that sovereignty isn't already extended to the high seas through other means. For example, our colleague Elizabeth Havis describes how Pacific Island nations that are parties to the Nauru Agreement for tuna fishing are collaborating to strengthen sovereignty in relation to their tuna resources. And they're doing this both in their respective EEZs, but also in the high seas pockets identified by my green arrow here, which their EEZs bound. Through the Nauru Agreement, member states collaborate to prohibit any vessels that want to fish in their EEZs from fishing in these high seas pockets. So PNA countries in collaboration have extended sovereign power over the high seas, creating a de facto conservation territory where the actors exerting control are a group of nations rather than a single nation state. So any new efforts to extend conservation territories to the high seas under an implementing agreement will intersect with and possibly conflict with this type of already existing extraterritorial sovereignty.
Finally, we note that the focus on the high seas lends itself to a particular kind of global view that emphasizes the interests of nation states while obscuring the rights and interests of other groups. Some advocates and scientists have been promoting the importance of indigenous peoples as rights holders in the high seas through, for example, connections established via transoceanic voyaging paths among Pacific Islanders, or the importance of migratory species to indigenous peoples and their roles in conserving them. So this is an effort to people the high seas in new ways and to think outside of established ideas of Westphalian state sovereignty. Now, our point here is that territory is the result not just of bounding space, of drawing lines on a map, but also of actors who exert control over that space. And this control is achieved materially via satellite surveillance, boats on the water, financing of projects, but also symbolically and discursively as we create maps and tell stories about what spaces are for and how they should be imagined. Territory involves defining what counts as in and out of any given space with associated winners and losers.
So we want to return to the understanding of oceans as a perfect and absolute blank, right? The high seas is sometimes described as undergoverned or as having governance gaps. The use of the term gaps invokes for me a sense of oversight, something that we've unintentionally failed to attend to or overlooked. With new knowledge and technology, we can address the oversights and fill in the gaps. But this perfect and absolute blank does not result from an oversight. It served political and economic interests. If indeed the alternating currents that Steinberg describes are moving towards territorial exclosure, the shifts are occurring, then an understanding of territory and territorial sovereignty suggests we need to pay careful attention to just what political and economic shifts are behind that shift. Whose interests are served and whose interests are marginalized? These questions seem at once both really basic and critically important, giving ongoing interest in changing how we govern one of the planet's largest remaining commons. That is the end of our three-part story. We just want to finish with a few thank yous. We want to thank Marie Pudester at the University of Guelph for making our maps. We've already mentioned some key collaborators in the papers we've drawn on for this talk, but we want to acknowledge that our ideas about oceans governance stem from multiple projects and collaborations over the years, and we've named key people and renamed them here. The work has been supported by a number of different funders through the projects, and we're grateful for that support. Finally, I was pleased to be scheduled in this talk after Pat's talk from last month. scheduled in the series. And we want to acknowledge Pat Halpin and his lab members generally for their willing engagement in our work over the years. When you're interested in the social and political outcomes of mapping, it's great to have access into one of the premier labs leading ocean mapping efforts globally. And it's even better when those lab members are willing to thoughtfully engage in discussion of their efforts. And that's it for us.
Fantastic. Lisa, Noella, thank you very much. This is Doug Nowacek chiming in to help with the Q&A. And just as a quick reminder to folks, please do put the questions in the Q&A. We won't be able to call on folks and have you ask your own questions, so sorry about that. Another quick thing, we'd like to do a quick poll, which we won't dwell on, but it's for our own edification and understanding who's attending, so we can think about programming as we go forward. So we'll share it in a bit. So there it goes. Thank you very much. We're all very practiced at this stage of the game. So again, a big thanks to Lisa and Noella for their participation and bringing in all that great work from you and from all your colleagues. So there have been a few questions in, and I'll just launch in if that's okay. I'll take them in the order pretty much they came in. I've aggregated them a little bit. One was a question about examples of OECMs other than marine refuges. In particular, any best practices or lessons learned for implementation of marine refuges in general, and what kinds are there?
So I think I would punt that question to Noella, who is looking carefully at OECMs, both through our international work, but in Canada as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we didn't talk about OECMs at all today. We were talking strictly about marine protected areas. For those in the crowd who don't speak acronym E's, OECMs are other effective area-based conservation measures. And the CBD IT Target 11 specifically called for 10% of the oceans to be protected in marine protected areas or OECMs. And so the OECM designation is a more recent one. Even though that target was established in 2010, it took until 2018 for the CBD to agree on a definition of OECMs. And many parties to the CBD, countries that are signatories, are still working out how they will identify OECMs within their respective territories. Importantly, OECMs are often not new designations. They're designating sites that already exist, just often not for the purpose of conservation. So for example, at sea, these might be sites that are shipwrecks, are protected sites. It might be protected for cultural heritage, but also achieving biodiversity conservation. So that cultural heritage site now gets counted as an OECM. So in our talk today, we haven't talked too much about OECMs. That is very much a work in progress. As I said, different countries are still deciding how to identify and list those OECMs. So I'm a bit familiar with the Canadian context, but in the interest of time, I don't think I'll go on a tangent about it. Yeah,
okay. We do have another related question, but I think I'll hold so we can get to the more MPA focused ones. The next question was about revocation of MPAs, whether it's happened, if there are examples. Is it easy? Is it difficult? Yeah, revoking MPAs.
Yeah, so I can start at that, and Noella can add if she thinks of anything else. So I think in one sense, this is a political question, but it's also an ecological question. There's been a lot of reflection in the terrestrial MPA literature in particular about the relevance of area-based management in a shifting climate, right? So if the things we're valuing have moved, what do we do with these sort of protected area legacy spaces? So I think it's an important question from a perspective of landscape planning and change and climate. But it's also been thought of politically, right? We almost found out, well, we sort of did find out, right? The Trump administration did change the protected area off the east coast of the northeastern US. And it threatened to undermine the marine monuments in the Pacific. And those ones didn't go as far. So I think it would depend on the actual mechanisms would depend on the legal structures within the countries. And I would just direct, Mike Masha did a study a couple of years ago on de-gazetting protected areas. He was focused in terrestrial spaces, I think, or maybe it was both terrestrial and marine, but he looked specifically about how common it is. And if I recall correctly, it's really not very common once they're in place. And there's a combination of legal and political things that contribute to that. I do want to say one thing about the high seas. There's been some interesting politics associated with that EBSA process that Pat Halpin's lab has been involved in, where countries went through a process of identifying potential, well, they wouldn't even call them potential sites of conservation. They went through a process of identifying these ecologically and biologically significant areas. They really tried to dissociate that initial conversation from the politics of actually establishing them as marine protected areas. And they did that both in the high seas and regionally, where they overlap with EEZs. And since that process, some countries have attempted to remove their EBSAs from the CBD EBSA database. They're not even protected areas, right? Like they haven't been designated, but there's a politics around that. And again, we found, and we haven't spent a lot of time on that issue, but we found that territory becomes an issue as well, right? What does it mean to be data-based by the CBD when the space that you're acknowledging flows over into national territory? So it's a really interesting question, and that's a long answer. I don't know if it's really difficult or if it's just really uncommon.
Got it. Anything, Noella, to add before we move on?
No, I think that's good. Happy to move on.
All right, awesome. Okay, next was a sort of a 2 or 3 parter about, and I would just surmise it as effectiveness of MPAs in achieving their goals, especially for things like large pelagic fishes, and like comparison, for example, to RFMOs and what RFMOs do that's different. Well, I don't know that we want to get into that, but generally the effectiveness of MPAs.
I can start, Lisa. I mean, I think I want to be clear that we did not evaluate the effectiveness of these large-scale MPAs. And so I don't want to speak beyond the data or our work. More broadly, the literature, of course, it depends who you read. There is consensus in the scientific literature that certain kinds of MPAs are effective for meeting particular kinds of objectives, right? And so the devil's in the detail, of course. What are the objectives? How are you assessing whether those are being met? For large-scale MPAs specifically, I would say that there's still more questions maybe than answers on their effectiveness on both the ecological and the sort of social and political side. And in terms of our work looking at social and political outcomes of large-scale MPAs, one thing that we found is while in some ways they're very similar to smaller MPAs, there are similar kinds of processes in politics and things that people are concerned about. When you get to these really large-scale MPAs, you're talking about national level governments and economic development priorities. And so how we measure effectiveness, we're talking about fundamentally sort of a different scale of process and different kinds of things. You know, small islands are trying to build national economies around these things, which is a different kind of question from most smaller MPAs. But I'll turn over to Lisa, see if she wants to add to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think we lack information on effectiveness for large scale MPAs. And I think that what we know from small scale MPAs can inform us to a point. But certainly those working in the field would like to see more research done on those questions.
Yeah, awesome. Excellent, thanks. One on the small island states, there was a comment, one of the listeners saying, working with some of the delegates from small island states who want to call themselves big ocean states, so they can use the acronym BOSS. So just wanted to pass that along, which is actually a segue to the next question about, and it relates a little bit to the revocation of the establishment. So there's a question about feasibility of creating an international organization that could lead and control MPAs in Abnjs. And I know there's not very many examples. I'm familiar with the Rossi one, but maybe just some thoughts on the sort of international organization around that one, but then also around larger Abnjs, MPAs.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would note that the BBNJ negotiations, so the negotiations for the implementing agreement under UNCLOS that will address biodiversity conservation in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Those are ongoing, and there were 4 sessions. The 4th session was planned for March of 2020 and of course got postponed. And so we're sort of at the tail end of negotiations on that agreement. And I am not 100% up to date on where those negotiations are at, so I don't want to speak in specific terms. More generally, though, this question of area-based conservation measures on the high seas and processes for establishing them, identifying them, and then enforcing any rules associated with them are really quite thorny. And so my suspicion is that they will try to overlay with existing institutions. One of the previous questions talked about RFMOs, for example. But as you can all imagine, this is very politically fraught and quite complicated. And that's, you know, part of what we're pointing to are the governance complications here. I don't think they're insurmountable, but I think I would go back to our concluding sort of comments about stepping back and asking, you know, who's at the table even in deciding those things and who's not. The default is that it's certain nation states, and we know how UN politics tend to play out and which states actually assert more control in those processes and negotiations, and that those negotiations often are leveraged based on other unrelated issues. So there's a lot of questions, and I don't have a lot of answers right now.
I also know there's a couple of people on the call that are following these negotiations more closely than we are. So I would be really hesitant to pinpoint specifics, but just reiterate that, you know, when we first heard about what could happen on the high seas, you know, I would say 12 years ago at one of the meetings we were attending, or 10 years ago, all of it was like finding the areas. And I think finding the areas it's not easy. And there's different interpretations of like what areas are worth protecting. It's then the how you do it. I think there's a lot of optimism right now about some of the remote surveillance technologies and how those can be mobilized for things like enforcement. I know Global Fishing Watch, which is focused on fisheries, is now developing some kind of algorithm to speak to issues of marine protected areas. So I think there's a lot of different possibilities being talked about, but I think, you know, we're always, I really do mean like they're basic and critical questions of what do any of those choices or decisions or possibilities imply for who benefits and who loses in these negotiations.
Yeah, right. Well, part of that question was monitoring technologies. So I'm glad you brought that in. Thanks, Lisa. Maybe one more quick question, and then we'll have a quick wrap up. And that was a question I thought was really interesting about how Indigenous knowledge has been brought into the delineation, creation, you know, whatever it is of MPAs in general. But I think the question came along during a large scale discussion. So maybe pertinent to that. I'm not positive, but Indigenous knowledge.
You want to go?
Sure, I can start. So it's a great question. And again, it's highly variable. There's not a story of how it's happened for large scale MPAs. There's many stories of how it's happened in particular sites. And certainly, you know, some of our colleagues and collaborators and other scholars who've worked at other sites could speak to this. For example, in Papahanaumokuakea, where we did not do work, but we have, you know, colleagues and collaborators there. That was an executive presidential decree, right? There was no Indigenous knowledge on first Bill Clinton's desk and then Obama's desk when it was, you know, expanded. However, there's been a lot of effort after the fact to integrate Native Hawaiian knowledge, cultural practices into ongoing management of the site. So there's both what happens in the lead up to establishment, and then there's also ongoing management and how things are changed over time. So I point to both of those. I think there's a danger in, you know, these are often ongoing processes, and establishment is a single moment in time, but there's a lot precedes that, and there's a lot that follows that. So maybe Lisa, you could speak to the Rapa Nui case a bit.
Yeah, again, I think in the Rapa Nui case, it's less about Indigenous knowledge of marine space as Indigenous rights over territory, right? And those are really complex and tied up in a special statute in Rapa Nui. So in that case, it wasn't as much knowledge as just recognition of rights and some of the conflicting mandates through different international agreements the Chilean government is signatory to. I'd note on the high seas, we do see, and we cited some of the papers of groups that are promoting Indigenous engagement in the high seas negotiations because of their understanding, knowledge, relations with migratory species and also histories. And some of those are being made by Indigenous people, and some of those are being made on behalf of Indigenous people. And I think it's interesting to think about how that effort will actually play out in the final negotiations. And we just don't have an answer to that yet.
Yeah, excellent. All right, well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Really big thank you to the two of you, and for everybody for joining, but for preparing that and leading us in that really interesting discussion. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dan Vermeer. So thanks again, Lisa and Noella.
Yeah, thanks, Doug, and thanks, Lisa and Noella, for a fascinating discussion. I think this is a great follow-on to the last session's discussion of ocean mapping, and just reminding that all of these efforts are tied to the kind of social and political context that they're happening in and have real consequences for real people. So I think part of what we're trying to do with this webinar series is to see oceans in really 360 degrees and bring different disciplinary approaches and sort of depth research, but then be able to connect the dots. In our next session, we will go, I think, pretty far afield, but where there is sort of indirect connections to talk about the relationship between oceans and human health. And so Jason Somarelli will be joining us for that discussion. And of course, oceans have an enormous impact and also great potential, I think, to be relevant to discussions of public health, which are on everybody's minds right now. So really looking forward to that discussion. I invite you back. Jason Somarelli's presentation will be on March 16. So mark your calendars and we'll be in touch now that you're on our mailing list. We really look forward to kind of building this community with all of you to participate in these monthly discussions. Please go to the Oceans at Duke website and dig into the materials there. We really appreciate the questions. We had 40 questions and obviously don't have time to go through all of those, but really appreciate your engagement and hope that this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. So thank you all for being here. Look forward to seeing you next month and have a great week. Take care.